Thank you, Peter. This is going to be very much a personal account of Operation Jericho, or as I should say, Ramrod 564, because during the war it was referred to as Ramrod 564. It was one of a number of raids which were given a code number. It only became known as Operation Jericho after the war when the French made a film about it. I came to this raid in a rather odd way, so I'm going to just fill you in a little bit of background, but suffice to say, I have met 12 of the aircrew who were on the raid and about 3 of the resistance people who were in the prison at the time of the attack. So some of what I'm going to tell you is based on books and some of it is based on actually speaking to the people involved. So I'm going to take you back about 34, 35 years. And Major and Mrs. Holt's battlefield tours. So, in the 1970s, Tony and Valmai Holt started writing books and taking people on visits to battlefields. I think to begin with, mainly the Somme, the Ypres salient, but these became so popular that in fact they ended up taking people all over the world. So when I say all over the world, literally all over the world, the Falklands, Vietnam, American Civil War, South Africa, Boer War, you name it, they went there. The prolific authors, in fact I've got one of the books here on the Somme, well worth reading, and they've been recognised as pioneers in battlefield tourism. Originally, Holt's tours had First World War vets, First and Second World War vets on, which was tremendously interesting to meet people who actually been there 100 plus years, then 70 odd years ago. Valmai is actually with us this evening, so Valmai, thank you for coming along. Very sadly, Tony is no longer with us. So, my main interest is medieval warfare, arms and armour, and the 100 Years' War. And about 1986, I started working for Holt's, taking people on trips to France, Italy, the UK, looking at 100 Years' War, Norman conquest, like out of the time period, the Condottieri in Italy, and like subjects. That, by the way, is me about 30 years ago when I was slim and had dark hair, was more intelligent. Two features of the tours I did was, number one, you never had vets on them, so you never had people saying, sorry, that's wrong, which is very, very handy, because everything happened 600 years ago. The second feature was I used to take a longbow and arrows and sometimes a crossbow with me, and we used to have the guests shooting arrows in fields round France, and it was the only Holt's tour for which there was an ammunition budget. Arrows. In 1990, I did a tour to Agincourt Cressy, and following the tour, I had a debrief with Valmai in Sandwich, and Valmai said, is there anything else you might be interested in? I said, well, how about Operation Jericho? And I at that time didn't know a huge amount about it, but the two of us had a talk. Valmai started writing notes down. Valmai picked up the phone, spoke to one or two people, and she realised it might be viable. So we decided to run the first tour in 1991 around the date, in fact, over the date when the commemoration of the raid, 18th of February, was going to take place. In early 1991, Valmai, Colonel David Story of the Royal Marines, very nice person, and myself, we all went to France, the Amiens area, which was deep in snow at the time, very cold, and we got the telephone directories out, and we simply looked up names of people who we'd picked up in the books, and we simply phoned them. And that way we managed to track down people who were there on that day in 1944. A week or two later, we did the first tour. It was very popular. I think we took 2 coaches with us, and we had one member of the aircrew who had been on the tour itself, and that was Cecil Dunlop, who had been a navigator with Maxwell or Maxie Sparks in one of the Mosquitoes. So, fast forward to 1994, and of course that was the 50th anniversary, and we didn't have one member of the aircrew with us, we had 12. So pilots, navigators of the Mosquito aircraft, and also 3 pilots of the Typhoon escort planes that had been on the raid as well. We had Norman Didwell, who was a fitter in the RAF who'd worked during Pickard's time on the Lysanders and such like. We also had Percy Pickard's widow, Dorothy Pickard, with us, and his granddaughter, Nicole Pickard. So it was a very interesting tour indeed. You're probably aware that there's quite a few books on the raid, notably by Colonel Gilbert Renaud and Philippe Livry-Lavelle, who were both involved with it at the time. Also, Fishman, who in the early 1980s went round and interviewed lots of people in the RAF, in MI6, SOE, and in France who were involved. More recently, Jean-Pierre Dusselier, who's written 2 books on the subject, which are presenting an alternative view, which I'll tell you about a bit later. And then Robert Lyman, who also has written 2 books over about the last 15 years on the subject. I have to say, though, none of these books could be described as strictly sort of academic. So you go to them looking for references and so on, and unfortunately they are lacking. And I should also add that Fishman's book, although he interviewed lots of people, he was a journalist, and what he produced is like a novel. It's a potboiler. So you read it, and it's a little bit OTT, I would say. And of course, low-level mosquito attacks have been covered in various films. 633 Squadron, very famous, with the music by Ron Goodwin, with its 6 and 3 beat time signature taken from 633. Totally fictional. Mosquito Squadron, fictional also, but it does feature a prison break. And then, I'm not going to say that's Danish, The Shadow in My Eye, 2021, a very good film on 140 Wing RAF and the attack on the Gestapo HQ in Copenhagen. And very sadly, that ended in tragedy because one of the planes crashed into a school. So, a lot of the action is featured around Amiens, France. And during the Second World War, Amiens was of extreme importance to the Germans. It was a transport hub. If you see, it's sort of north of Paris. Very important on the rail network. So you've got Amiens there, Beauvais, Paris, and then lines up to Boulogne, Calais, lines also going east. It was a major centre for goods, war materials being brought in from Germany into northern France and Normandy. So extremely important in terms of communications. It's also on the canal network, and the Germans were making use of canals, and it's also obviously on the road network. It came under the German Military Administration District A, and it split into 14 sub-districts, and Amiens came under can't speak German, but Feldkommandanturin, which is FK 580, which was responsible for upholding law and security, security of the occupation troops in France, preserving calm in the rear of the Western Front, and very importantly to the Germans, optimising the exploitation of France in support of the German war economy. The Germans saw France and other occupied countries as being resources which they could plunder. So there's a very good book, I think, The Wages of Destruction, which goes into this in great detail, but tells you all about how the German plan was to take food, grain, iron ore, other goods extracted from these countries in order to maintain their war economy. It was a major transit centre for German war materials. It was also a centre for imprisoning resistants, or political prisoners as they were called. And up to 200 political prisoners were held in the prison and interrogated there or at the Citadel or the Gestapo HQ. And this is in 1994 on the anniversary tour. So this was the Gestapo HQ. A few of us went in there. It still feels, it's simply the layout of the building. It still feels cold and chilling and so on. But you could, I'm not into picking up vibes, but you can definitely pick up the vibes in there. People were tortured in there. Executions took place at the prison, but shootings were at the Citadel or in the ditches at the moat at Arras. So it was very important from the German point of view. It was extremely important from the Allied point of view, and it was a priority one target for the D-Day invasion. It also featured in Solly Zuckerman's transportation plan. That is, his plan that in order for the invasion to succeed, they needed to completely nobble the German transport system. And of course, the Germans were heavily reliant on the rail networks. Their tanks had to be taken to the front by train. So very important from that point of view. It was also very important on the invasion route, because as Amiens and the area became a target for the Allied bombers, so too the Allied bombers got shot down, and you had lots of people evading the Germans, being taken up by French evasion resistance groups who put them through Amiens and then on the trains down to Paris, and then from Paris it was then down south through France into Spain and back home. It was important because, in terms of the plans for the invasion, because they wanted to make sure that they could cut the train lines and delay trains and also sabotage the German war effort. It was also extremely important for intelligence gathering, particularly for the V1. So we all know about the V1. So the work by resistance and reconnaissance aircraft revealed the threat of the V1. The V1 was a pilotless bomb powered by a pulse jet, weighed about 2 tons, and the warhead was just under 1 ton. Average speed was about 340 miles an hour, and 10,000 were fired at England, of which 2,400 reached London. Killed about 6,200 people and injured about 18,000. Hitler's plans were to launch 5,000 a day, not 10,000 during the whole campaign. Obviously, as we know, Hitler had very grandiose ideas at times, and the German war economy wasn't up to producing that many V1s. So, the red circle shows you where Amiens is, and all those dots are V1 launch sites in an arc, and some more on the Cherbourg Peninsula here. And the important thing was that the V1 didn't have that great a range, so all of these sites are within range of London. The V1s were an extremely serious threat to the invasion. If they started dropping them onto the embarkation ports, it could have created a huge problem. The V2, as we know, was a rocket. The V2 was beginning to come in at this time, but thankfully the V2 bombing and that thankfully put paid to most of the V2 campaign, but not all of it. There was a V1 storage depot 10 miles south of Reims, and it's possible the V1s were transported into the V1 launch areas via train via Amiens. So Amiens was important for the V1s as well. Also, for a while, Amiens was the HQ for the rocket regiment that was going to be shooting the V1s. It was later on moved to Creil-sur-Mer, about 70 miles west, not far from Dieppe. Now, just to say something about the French resistance, given the choice between doing a lecture on the origins of the 100 Years' War and the French resistance, I would go with the 100 Years' War every time. It's extremely complicated. It's not straightforward. Communist resistance groups could ally with right-wing ones and vice versa. All sorts of rivalries, turf wars, and all of this complicated by the fact that there was also turf wars between MI6 and SOE in the UK, making things even more difficult to work out. However, just very briefly, you had the FTPF, which was the Front Tireur et Partisan Français, which is the military branch of the French Communist Party, active from about 1941 onwards. Once the Germans went to war against the Russians, they became active. They were very much a hands-on, let's get stuck in organisation. So they destroyed rail lines, sabotaged factories, killed Germans, punished traitors and collaborators, Members of the group included the Lemaire family, and famously in late 1943, I think about the 24th of December, a member of the group, Charles Lemaire, who's here, he and some others either threw some grenades into a restaurant and hotel or put some bombs there and ended up killing about 33 German soldiers. The hotel was being used, had been simply requisitioned by the Germans. 4 members, male members of the family, were involved in resistance, and 4 died fighting for the resistance. 3 of them shot by the Germans when they were captured, these 3 here. And then this is young Arthur Lemaire, who in 1944, when the Germans were basically evacuating from Amiens because of the Allied advance, he went out with some grenades to throw them at some Germans and was never seen again. So presumably killed and put in an unmarked grave. So quite a tragedy for the family. They also, and this is not very distinct, but that group was also very much involved in train derailments, to begin with, using explosive here. But explosives were noisy. Obviously, if you've got caught with explosives on you, it's obvious what you're doing. So latterly, they took to simply going out with crowbars and big spanners and dismantling the rail lines so that the train would be derailed without using explosives. And one of the resistance people I spoke to in 1991 was involved with this and told me about this. You then had the OCM, the Organisation Civile and Militaire, resistance group formed in 1940, mainly recruited from the bourgeoisie, included business people, former soldiers, professionals, architects, and so on. And they, even though they were reasonably right-wing, certainly in northern France, in the Amiens area, they did ally with the communist resistance group. You also then had the Sozis, which is the lookalikes, and this was formed by Dominique and Pierre Ponchardier, and this was active all over France, and very important resistance group. They reported to MI6, and they were very much involved in the intelligence network tracking down V1 launch sites. And just to give you an idea of the V1 launch site, this here is a drawing that was given to pilots and others in early 1944 as an exemplar of what a V1 launch site looked like. They got the information from this from photographic reconnaissance by aircraft, but also by observation on the ground. And observation on the ground meant French resistance people or SOE people who'd been dropped in. So clearly, very, very dangerous thing for these people to be doing. Interestingly, this one is at a place called Maisoncelles. So I can now get the 100 Years' War into this talk, because it's at Maisoncelles where possibly the English army spent the night of the 24th to 25th of October 1415, prior to the Battle of Agincourt. And I've been here several times, and you can see many of the features still on the ground. Here you've got Maisoncelles, there you've got Azincourt, Tramcourt, and this is the traditional site of the battle, although there is some dispute over that. In the little churchyard, which is here, there is this gravestone that commemorates, I think, 4 or 5 victims of a low-level aerial attack on the V1 ramp. So, of course, what the Germans were doing was they were disguising the V1 launch sites in amongst farm buildings and other places to make it more difficult to see where they were. So when the Allies hit them, then they were more likely to create civilian death. There's also the Possum Network, and I put this in here because it's very interesting. The Possum Network operated evasion lines. That is, they helped Allied pilots, helped find Allied pilots and get them out of France and on the way back to the UK. So they operated evasion lines, and you've got to remember that one of the people behind the attack was Basil Embry, who was an escaper, an evader. He was shot down over France and got home with the help of the French. By about 1944, 50% of aircrew who bailed out over France were being got out of France back to the UK, sometimes within a week or two. That's how effective they became. But the danger to the resistance people involved in this was extreme. So this group had about 59 agents, and of that, about half, 27, were killed or simply disappeared, and 28 were deported, but thankfully came home. So if you were in that group, you had about a 50-50 chance of surviving the war. On to the RAF. So 140 Wing RAF was behind the attack. 3 of their squadrons were involved in it. This shows you mosquitoes being readied for a raid, and this tall man here is Percy Pickard. The wing was commanded by Air Vice Marshal Basil Embry. Embry was CO of commanding officer of 2 Group and in command of 140 Wing. He retired in 1956 as an Air Chief Marshal. He began the war flying Bristol Blenheims over France, got shot down in May 1940, and a book was written about his escape. It's a real adventure story, very, very dangerous, but part of it was in the area of Huculier in northern France. This family here looked after him and helped him get south to the Somme. He crossed the Somme and went south, went to Paris, and then finally got to Spain and out back to the UK. These 3 people could have been captured by the Germans and deported or simply shot straight away. And if you were deported, you had a 1/3 chance of coming home again. He was very keen on training, expected high standards of his crews, and flew with his squadrons on some of the missions. Quite a dangerous thing to do. In late 1943, he was concerned. He fought to get the Mosquito in his wing because he thought that was the best plane for low-level attacks in France. However, having trained his crews, he was very concerned that there weren't enough targets for them. And he kept pressing the RAF for low-level targets that were suitable for his crews to have a go at as part of their training. However, by December 1943, that was solved because at that point they started the no-ball raids against the V1s. Group Commander Percy Charles Pickard, the tall man there, next to Lysander, and there he is. This is John Allen Broadley, who was with him on the Jericho raid, and Broadley is helping him on with his Mae West life jacket. Pickard became famous to the public through the film Target for Tonight. So if you look it up, he features in that film. It's about a raid using, I think, a Wellington bomber or similar. He also led the flying components of the Brunival raid on the 27th to the 28th of February to steal German radar equipment. The raid was a success. He dropped the parachutists, the paratroopers, over the target, and then they were recovered by motor gunboats. In 1943, he commanded 161 Squadron, delivering SOE agents to France, but also bringing out resistance people and evaders, aircrew who'd escaped. He also pressed to use larger aircraft. So I think at one point they were using Hudsons, and he got stuck in a field in one in which it was so muddy that the wheels bogged down, he couldn't take off. So the French had to get horses to drag the plane out of the mud, and then he took off and thankfully got back. He was made commanding officer of 140 Wing in late 1943. He wasn't very experienced at low-level attacks at the time of Jericho. He'd only done about 5 at that time. Squadron leader Philippe Lavelle, often known as Livry Lavelle, Livry was his resistance pseudonym. Livry won medals in the First World War. He was French. He fought in the French resistance, and then in about 1941 got out of France, got to the UK, wanted to join the RAF, but he was told he was too old because at that time he was 43. So he went round a number of recruiting offices telling them, and finally one of them bought the story that he was 29. So he joined 161 Squadron under Pickard. He confessed to Pickard that he was 43, or 44 then, and Pickard said it doesn't matter how old you are, if you're flying low level in France and hit a tree, it makes no difference. He fought over Normandy, and he also took part in the March 21, the 21st of March 1945 attack on the Gestapo HQ in Copenhagen. He was ordered off. There's a book. He wrote part of a book on the operation, and you get this very strong impression that this was a personal war. He didn't like the Germans. He didn't like what the Germans were doing to his country. March 1945, de Gaulle thought he was so important that he ordered him to quit flying, and Lavelle went on to feature in the French government after the war. He was one of the most highly decorated French servicemen of the Second World War. Multiple medals. Interestingly, his daughter, Monique, they had a very nice house in Normandy, a very big house. The Germans were there, and after D-Day, the Germans shot 20 to 30 Canadians in the grounds of the chateau. Monique saw this and joined the French resistance. She got arrested, taken to Ravensbrück, and thankfully she survived. And in fact, as you can see from the newspaper report, she died in 2012. Pilot officer Lee Howard, he was in the film Mosquito was on the raid. Cameraman on the raid, flew quite a few missions where they were photographing and filming the raids. After the war, he wrote books. One of them was made into film, and he became editor of the Daily Mail in 1960. If you are flying a raid over France or Germany, you do not want to be flying this man. The reason is, like any photographer, when you're over the target, he kept saying, and I spoke to a pilot who'd flown him, he kept saying, oh, can you just do another run round? And this pilot said to me at one point, and of course he was in the nose looking down with the cameras, and this pilot said to me, he said, right, get up into the cockpit, Lee. So Lee did this, and he said, look out at the canopy. And Lee said, yeah, I can't see anything. He said, that's right, the escort planes have gone home, the bomber force has gone home, the only planes that are going to be in the sky now are German fighters coming in to intercept us. So they hightailed it for home. Flight Lieutenant, anyone see the connection with the name? Yeah, Tony Benn's brother. Michael Julius Wedgwood Benn. He was on the raid. I think he was in 21 Squadron, and that was the squadron that didn't drop bombs. Very sadly, he died, I think, in June 44, when there was an instrument failure in the cockpit of his Mosquito. The plane overshot the runway, hit a wall by the sea, and flipped into the sea. His navigator rescued him, but sadly he had injuries he couldn't survive. Okay, so the plane used in the attack, for the bombing part of the attack, was of course the Mosquito, the famous wooden wonder. One thought is that you could make do with one engine on the Mosquito, but they thought they put a second engine on just for fun. Very, very fast, could be very heavily armed, made out of a combination of woods, like a balsa wood and other things. This meant that factories could be factories that made chairs, air coal, things like that, could go onto the war effort to help produce this plane. A true multi-role aircraft, night fighter, fighter bomber, V-1, interceptor, the list goes on. It was used as a fast transport plane to and from Sweden, bringing ball bearings back from Sweden for the war effort. Maritime strike, attacking U-boats. Did about 370 to 400 miles an hour. Would do 300 miles an hour at zero height. The specific type used in the attack was the Mark 6. And the Mark 6 could carry about a ton of bombs, and it had 4 cannons, 20 millimeter cannons, and 4 Browning 303 machine guns. The 20mm cannons themselves could do enormous damage to targets such as ships. Interestingly, the Mosquito was used against the V1. I think for when V1s are coming over at night, because you had a navigator there, it made it easy to, rather than have a single-seater plane at night time, you had a navigator, you had a radar. So if you look, in terms of V1 shot down, you've got the anti-aircraft guns, which by about mid-44 onwards were using proximity fuses and using radar gun laying, followed by the Hawker Tempest, and then the Mosquito. And as you see, the Mosquito shot down double the V1s than the Spitfire did. But as we know, we always think about the Spitfire when they're shooting down V1s. This is a Second World War cartoon by Giles, and just to illustrate, you've got, it looks like in Holland and the Netherlands, and of course you've got the very low-flying Mosquitoes thundering over. The other plane that was used in the raid was the Hawker Typhoon. This was like the successor to the Hawker Hurricane. Had some teething problems, but once they got them sorted out, it became a formidable ground attack plane and also a formidable low-level interceptor. Very, very rugged plane, was famously used at the Falaise Pocket, rocket firing, and had 4 cannons. Right, so in 1994, we had squadron leader Dick Sugden with us, and he gave me a photocopy of his log for February 1944. Interestingly, 29 days in February that year, he flew on operations on 13 days. That shows you how busy they were. Most of these were V1 sites, including somewhere along here is Cressy, and Cressy is the Battle of 1346. There were V1 launch ramps in that area. You'll also notice an operation in Pas-de-Calais where the aircraft was hit by flak, also damaged by tree, because obviously the tree jumped up in front of the plane. And there we have the 18th Operation Secret to Amiens. Very successful, terrible weather. So, going on to the raid itself, the pilots were briefed about 8 o'clock in the morning. It was a shocking day on the 18th of February 1944, low cloud and snowstorms. The crews were told 120 French patriots were going to be shot imminently, and a number of these have been condemned for assisting Allied airmen to escape. They were also told they needed to get down to as low as possible, and they were told low as possible meant 10 feet off the ground. Blacksmith, wing commander, one of the people on the raid, had a private word with Percy Pickard, and he said, if we release the bombs at that height at more than 250 miles an hour, the bombs will shatter when they hit the target. So the crews were briefed to keep the speed at low level under 250 miles an hour. Years later, Smith said, we heard the details of this raid with considerable emotion. After 4 years of war, just doing everything possible to destroy life, here we were going to use our skill to save it. It was a grand feeling, and every pilot left the briefing room prepared to fly into the walls rather than fail to breach them. There was nothing particularly unusual in it as an operational sortie, but because of this life-saving aspect, it was to be one of the greatest moments in our lives. There were going to be 3 waves of Mosquitoes, 3 groups of 6. They were going to be synchronized over the target. The bombs had to be fused to 11 seconds, because if you drop a bomb at very low level and it goes off immediately, it will blow your plane out of the sky. So they had to be synchronized, they had to be timed to 11 seconds, but also each wave, there had to be a certain number of seconds between each wave, otherwise the wave behind would pick up the blast from the bombs going off from the wave in front. There was a field Mosquito, as I mentioned, that was crewed by Flight Lieutenant Wickham and Pilot Officer Howard. And Percy Pickard was to fly last of the second wave of 12 aircraft. He would call in the 3rd wave if the walls weren't breached. And I think it was green, green, green meant that the third wave should attack, and red should be, they call it off. They were going to use two Typhoon escorts from number 174 and number 198 squadrons. Maxwell Sparks, who was always called Maxie Sparks, thought they'd call it off and thought it was some sort of practical joke. They flew in very low over the sea at about 300 miles an hour, and they were going to aim for a position on the French coast where there was a farm and a square wood. And Livry-Lavelle mentioned this in a couple of books. There was a farm about 3 kilometres west of Creil-sur-Mer in a square wood. And there is Creil-sur-Mer, there's the square wood, and there's the farm today. So it's still there, very much so. As they approached that farm, I think it was Sparks said, or Dunlop said, that thinking it could be blacksmith in front of him, his plane suddenly rose over the headland. And he only found out later that they had used this very same farm for attacks on V1 launch ramps as a navigation point. And he was worried that the Germans might have put flak batteries in there. So they rose up to get over them before getting back down on the ground. Very much a feature of the coach I was on in 1994 was Maxie Sparks and his navigator, Arthur Cecil Dunlop. Arthur Cecil Dunlop preferred the name Cecil. Maxie said no man should be called Cecil, and so called him Alan, I think. So they crewed together. Very interesting people to talk to. On the anniversary of the 50th anniversary, as we were rolling down the Albert to Amiens road, which was the road they came in on for the attack, I got Maxie to the front of the coach, and he said to me that, I said, well, what was it like? Describe to the people on this coach what it was like. And he said, we were thundering down this road, we were in 2 groups of 3. He said, our 2 planes were on this side of the trees, and the other plane was here, but we were so low we couldn't see the other plane because they were about 10 or 20 feet above the ground. He said the plane was struggling because it was carrying about a ton of bombs doing 190 miles an hour to 200 miles an hour, and that was slow for a Mosquito. So he was having to fly those up. He was also having to count the wing because it was so close to these trees. This is the road today. That's a little farm track. At this point, they had 20 seconds before they hit the prison. Maxie said that there were people walking along the road, cycling along the road, suddenly seeing this plane coming towards them and throwing themselves to the ground. That's how low they were. The whole thing was over in literally seconds from Maxie's point of view. So here, this is the Bombay camera with a mirror, so it's taking a photograph back towards the prison. That's the tail wheel of Maxie Sparks' Mosquito. There's the prison, and there's one of these bombs going off there. That's the Albert to Amiens road. The first wave hit it from the east. Other waves came in from the north to break other holes in the walls. The whole attack, which consisted of 12 planes, lasted from 12:03 hours to 12:07 hours, 4 minutes. That was the sum total of the raid. Howard and Wickham in the Cameron Mosquito overflew the prison at various heights, going down to 200 feet. And this is Howard's detailed report on the raid. And at one point he says in here, because it says, did you use handheld cameras over the target? And he said he couldn't because of excessive G. So that Wickham was jinking the Mosquito to make sure that the flak or German fighter couldn't get onto them. And that meant that the G force prevented Wickham from using the handheld cameras. In the prison itself, there was huge confusion. They used a combination of high explosive bombs to blow holes in the walls, and they used blast bombs to blow out the doors of the prison. In 1991, I met Audrey-Emile Leroy, who was in the prison in a condemned cell. He said he was part of Jean Buren's network which derailed trains. Andre said to me he was told he was going to be shot on the 19th of February, the following day. He was in a condemned cell with several others, but it was difficult to talk to anyone because he said you never knew if the Germans had planted stool pigeons in your cell. So there could have been German collaborators in there, and you might come out with something and they would report it back to the Germans. He'd been tortured, his feet and shoulders had been damaged, and the damage remained with him for the rest of his life. He heard noise, and the prison cell window was quite high up, so he got on someone else's shoulder to look through the window just as the blast hit him and blew him through the cell door. So he also had a bad back. He managed to escape and found a nearby cafe. So he ran to the cafe to try and merge in with everyone there. And a German soldier followed him in. The German soldier pointed his rifle at him and was about to shoot him when a German officer came in and said, no, you can't shoot him today. He's due to be shot tomorrow. At which point, Andre clocked the German soldier, got out the back, and was spirited away by the resistance, and managed to get south. And the resistance said to him, you've done enough for the resistance. For you, the war is truly over. And he survived. In the planes, Flight Lieutenant Hannafin, one engine caught fire, so he feathered the propeller, this is of the Mosquito, to restart it and to catch up with the formation. But the engine caught fire again, and he got wounded by flak. He had to then abort and start returning to the UK. He was wounded in the neck and paralysed on the right side, and his navigator gave him morphine injections to try and get him through. At one point, Maxie and Cecil in another Mosquito heard Hannafin calling out on the radio to one of the other Mosquitoes to come in to guide him back home, and they made it home. Group Captain Percy Pickard, he and Broadley, they were the last of the second 6 planes to bomb, and that was also always a dangerous point because that's often the last plane is the one that gets picked off. They got picked off by a Focke-Wulf 190, and they were sadly killed when the plane got shot up. The tailplane came off, and they crash-landed at Saint-Gretien, about 9 kilometres north-east of the prison. Both of them killed more or less instantly. Squadron leader Ian McRitchie and Richard Sampson got hit by flak. McRitchie crash-landed the Mosquito, but very sadly Sampson had been killed immediately by the bursting of the flak. And Sampson is buried a few miles outside Amiens, a place called Pointe de Picardy. The Typhoons, flight officer Renaud, who was French, he was shot down, survived, taken prisoner. Flight Sergeant Harry Shaw Brown was lost in a snowstorm and we presume went into the channel. His body in the plane's never been found. Now I'm going to try something, see if this works, and it might not work, in which case I'll go on. There is some film online you can see of the actual attack, but it's not loading. Okay, so the aftermath. These are reconnaissance photographs taken within days of the raid. Aerial photograph here, obviously, and then you can see the wings of the prison, which have been absolutely hammered by the bombing. There's a view that they had counted on the walls being thicker than they actually were, so they actually used too many bombs, which caused quite a few of the casualties. In terms of the results, it's very difficult because there are no clear figures as to how many people were in the prison at the time, and it's possible that they undercounted the numbers. This is the French and Germans, the French authorities at the time, in order to make it sound less embarrassing. There's supposed to have been 522 non-political prisoners in the prison on that morning, and 190 political prisoners. Political prisoners then meant you were likely to be resistant, and it meant the outlook for you was very poor. You were probably going to get shot or deported. So the total varies between 712 and 820, depending on what figure's correct. People killed in the attack was 95, we captured 518, and then the missing is between 99 and 207. And obviously those figures there, that 99 to 207 will have included resistance workers, but also criminals who had been locked up for other offences. One of the bombs skipped through or over the prison and resulted in a civilian death nearby, and you can see there's 4 RAF people killed in the raid. And to put these figures into context, there are no accurate figures for how many were in the French resistance or how many were killed in it, but probably something like 300 to 500,000 people were in the resistance. That includes Spanish Republican exiles who left Spain, a fascist regime, went to France trying to find freedom, and then wound up under the authority of another fascist regime, the Germans. 8,000 were killed in action, 25,000 resistance workers were shot, and about 86,000 deported, and roughly speaking, of those ones who were deported, 60,000 would have died in camps. And then the total French deported is 150,000, French military deaths 217,000, and French civilian deaths 350,000. More French died in the Second World War than more British people did, including armed forces, or more Americans. That puts it into context. The French and Germans did what they could to round up as many as they could. The French police got to the point where they just ignored some of the people who escaped who were possibly guilty of lower crimes. Of the French resistance people in the prison, some of them stayed to help rescue the injured people in the prison. Dr. Antonin Malt stayed to help. He was deported, but luckily for him, and thankfully for him, he survived. A very important figure, Raymond Vivant, who was sous-prefet of Abbeville, escaped and survived. Robert Bebo was part of the OCM network. He'd actually collected information in 1943 on the prison in order to possibly attack the prison, and some of this information was passed on to the RAF. He sadly died. Jean Buron of the communist FTPF escaped and survived. Sadly, Dr. Robert Beaumont, who was an MI5 agent in the Possum network, that's the evasion network, he died during the attack. But as I say, the 190 political prisoners in the prison did not have very good prospects at all. And a number of them who didn't escape from the prison or were caught later and brought back to the prison wound up being shot at the Mur de Fuselé in Arras. And André Tempez here, here's someone who might have been able to escape, but instead he stayed there to try and help his fellow French people. Incidentally, this is the memorial in Arras to the resistance. In late 44, after they'd been liberated, they found a mass grave of 260 French people who'd been shot by the Germans, unmarked graves. And it's very difficult to identify the corpses, and Tempez was one of the corpses there. These photographs were taken on the 50th anniversary visit in 1944. There's been considerable controversy over the raid. Trying to put it as simply as possible, the earliest accounts are very clear. The earliest accounts say the attack was called in by the French resistance. However, there's been considerable controversy as so many were killed in it. And another point of controversy is that possibly one resistance group asked for it, but many resistance people in another group died in it, and they hadn't taken any part in calling the raid in. There was also a certain vagueness as to who ordered the attack, and that's led to some alternative theories. One alternative theory is by a French author called Jean-Pierre Dusselier, and he's written 2 books. The one in 2002 is enormous, 750 pages, no references or index, and most of the bibliography consists of books on aircraft types, not on the resistance. He questioned the evidence for the traditional account. One of the things was he actually downplayed the importance of some of the resistance people in the prison, and he also said there was no one in the prison awaiting execution. Roughly 150 pages of this book here are devoted to the fortitude plan, which was the deception plan to make the Germans think we were going to invade via Nord-Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. So there's 150 pages of documents about fortitude, and not one of those documents mentions Amiens as being part of the fortitude plan. He presents no real evidence. He was in a documentary, I think about 2010, 2011, and a historian called Robert Lyman was involved as well. And I've been in touch with Robert Lyman. He was so angry by what Dusselier was saying that he decided to look at every file surviving about the raid, and that meant going to France, London obviously, and the USA. So he looked at everything. Lyman said that although the original orders and signals are lost, there's nothing in the evidence that suggests that it was anything other than an attempt to rescue resistance workers. And there's nothing in the evidence that suggests it was part of the deception plan. He believes it was simply called in by the Ponchardier brothers, and more of them very shortly. Dusselier's evidence starts to fall apart when you go on to some very academic sites that look into French resistance deaths during the Second World War. Looking at those sites, I've already found a number of people who were for a fact condemned to death and were awaiting execution. These 3 people here all died in the raid, all sentenced to death on the 10th of February 1944 by the Germans. They were probably going to be shot within days of the raid. I also spoke to André-Émile Leroy, who told me he was going to be shot on the 19th. And there's also evidence to say that Jean Buran, a young man, was due to be shot on the 20th of February. So the idea that, Dusselier's idea that they weren't rescuing anyone due to be shot doesn't really hold up. My view is that during the briefing, the pilots, navigators were told 120 were due to be shot, and there's like an old rule of 10 that if 12, it's likely that around 12 are due to be shot, including some important resistance people, and to make it sound more important, they simply multiplied it by 10. And that meant MI6 and others were more likely to accept the attack. Ponchardiers both became fairly important. Dominique, both of these were part of the SOSI network, intelligence gathering network in France, covered the whole of France. Dominique went on to become a diplomat and an author. Pierre went on to become an admiral in the French Navy. This is Jean Buran, one of the people who escaped. Ponchardier said very early on, Jean Buran's mother came to see me and said, he's due to be shot. Can you do something to help him? They already had plans on file, including plans they'd sent to Germany about what the jail was like. So the RAF already had the information about the target. It's just it became critical in the days leading up to the 18th of February to put something on. If they didn't do it then a number of people were going to die. And Dominique spent his entire life saying there was only one reason behind the raid, and that was to free French resistance people. He got fed up with this, and wound up telling people, all you've got to do is read the book by Renaud and Livry-Lavelle. That tells you everything you need to know about who called the raid in. Of course, after the war, things got political, and it could well be the Ponchardiers got fed up also because things had become politicised, and various factions in French politics. It might not have been the done thing to carry on going on about the raid and their part in it because of the number of people who died. But there's also something interesting. The 3 squadrons involved in Amiens were under Basil Embry. And, to go back just a moment, first of all, it was not unusual for the French resistance to attempt to blow holes in prisons to get people out. In the north, they'd already done it at Saint-Quentin, which is about 70 kilometres east of Amiens, and they also did it on the Abbeville prison in the 22nd of June. There will be other prisons around France where likewise they tried to spring resistance people out. So it was not unusual to try and blow up a prison. It was just unusual in that the method they used was to call planes in to do it. So, Basil Embry and 140 Wing, the 3 squadrons involved in the Amiens raid, carried out 3 attacks that were broadly similar. So obviously Amiens in February. In 1994, one of the pilots, either Wheeler or Taylor, said to me, I was involved in a secret raid. He said, some people are being killed in France, and we were told there was going to be a revenge attack on the German SS regiment that was responsible for these cold-blooded killings, and we were told to hit the area around the chateau in Bonneuil-Matour, which is not far from the Mauges. He said, unusually, a third of the planes were bombed up with napalm bombs from the US, because they wanted to make sure that the SS got the message that if you start shooting prisoners, we'll come after you. And July 1944, the 140 Wing attacked Bonneuil-Matour. There's no hard and fast casualty speakers for the SS there, but they pulled out of that base immediately afterwards. It was hammered by, I think, about 12 mosquitoes, and there was Mustangs with them as well. They were also told to shoot up the prison to cause more casualties, and the pilot I spoke to in 1994 said, we left a mosquito loitering over the target, and its role was to shoot up any ambulances that turned up. So this was to send a very clear message to the SS. And then, 21st of March 1944, very early on in the talk I mentioned the Danish film about this raid. This one is clear-cut. The Danish resistance called in 140 Wing to attack the Gestapo HQ in Copenhagen, and also to destroy, to try and release resistance workers there, and also to destroy Gestapo files. They were successful in that part of it, but tragically, one of the mosquitoes hit a lamppost or something and careered into a school, and other mosquitoes, seeing the smoke coming from the school, sadly bombed the school, and about 80 children tragically died because of that. So you could say that Embry, Picard, Livry-Lavelle, these are all people who are very pro-French resistance and will enthusiastically try and do things to help the French resistance. So, commemorations. There's been commemorations at Amiens since 1946. The big one was in 1994 because we had the 12 aircrew I mentioned, and these are the people who were with us, all members, either Mosquito navigators or pilots, or Typhoon pilots, and this is outside the prison on the 18th of February 1994. This is the hotel in Amiens on the final day, I think that's the 19th, that's a group of them there. There was a big French turnout, some very important people turned up. They put on a champagne reception for us in the prison. And I was there with David Story and some others. David was one of the co-leaders on the tour, and we were waiting for the French Director General of Prisons in northern France to arrive, and he was a bit late. And so David was talking to the group of us, and this man came up in like a sheepskin coat and started tugging David's coat like this. And David said, yes, who are you? And David said, we were waiting for the French Director General of Prisons. And the French man said, Monsieur, I am the French Director General of Prisons. This is Nicole Picard. This is Dorothy Picard here. So the widow of Percy Picard. That's David's story, unfortunately from the rear. This is Nicole Picard. So in 1991, when David and I went to Amiens, we knew the names of some of the people who recovered the bodies of Broadley and Picard from the Mosquito. And one of them was Serge Caget. And we went through the telephone directory and we phoned up every Caget in Saint-Grétien, and we struck lucky, and this is Serge. So in 1944, he was helping to bring Nicole's grandfather's body and Broadley's body out of the Mosquito. And there is Nicole, there's Dorothy, there's some of the air crew there. That's David's story. This is Ian McRitchie at Samson's grave at Poix de Picardy. So Samson was very badly injured. He had 26 wounds when the Mosquito crash landed. But sadly, his navigator was killed in the raid. This is a friend, this could be Andre Emile Leroy, who was in the prison at the time. He certainly is one of the resistance people who was in the prison. Skip forward to last year, 2024. The French put on an enormous commemoration event. With all the great and the good, it was a very moving event. They had some top military figures there. And this is outside the prison here. There was a number of speeches, and we then went on to the graveyard where Picard and Broadley are buried. But there was also another commemoration at Poix de Picardy where Samson's buried. And that's Samson's grave. And the French ex-military turned up again with their flags and banners, and there were speeches there, and they put on a reception for us. So I was at this one as well. So this is Claire Pepper, who was, she's the niece of Broadley, and this is Nicole Picard. Nicole lives in South Africa, and she comes over every so often for the commemorations. And these are the graves of Broadley and Picard, and you can see obviously the flowers. So a number of us, including Nicole, met a faintly mad French pilot. And on the 19th of February last year, after the commemoration event, he said, "You want to fly over the area and see it all?" So he said, "Yeah, okay, fine." This is Nicole in the plane with me behind. And this is the crash site of her grandfather's plane. That's where the Mosquito went in. 2 days earlier, a number of us had gone there, and there's still cannon shells in the mud from the Mosquitoes. These are still probably quite dangerous. And then, carrying on with the plane ride, we're evidently clearly not at 10 feet above the ground doing 200 miles an hour. But this is overflying. There's the prison today. This is the Albert Amiens raid, and this is the nearby cemetery, and Picard Broadley will be buried somewhere around there. And then earlier this year, I got invited to the commemoration event on the 18th, and it was heartening. It was very moving to see that obviously 2024 would be a big anniversary, 80 years, but a year later, it's still a big commemoration. And they had pipers there, quite a long event, and lots of people turned up, lots of ex-military, and we then all proceeded down to the cemetery to lay wreaths on the graves of Broadley and Picard. And we're getting towards the end now. So in 1994, I took the opportunity to get everyone to sign this book, which is the Fishman book on it. And there's some very this is Audrey Loire, Chevalier de Legion d'Honneur. He was in the prison. There's Dunlop, Bob Fowler, Arthur Wheeler, Duncan Buck Taylor, and so on. And more, another resistance person here, Dick Sugden, Nicole Pickard. So, just to very quickly sum up, there was an extremely difficult situation in Amiens in late 43, early 44, with resistance groups being rolled up by the Germans. This was partly due to the Germans' own intelligence, but also you had collaborators who were being paid by the Germans to shop their own countrymen. And one of the collaborators, interestingly, was assassinated very soon after the raid. One of the French communist resistance group condemned him to death. There was, I think, a teacher in Amiens who'd offered to help with the resistance. And so the resistance said, okay, we've got a job for you. You've got to assassinate this, you've got to steal a gun and a bicycle and assassinate this person. And he said, I'm too honest, I can't steal anything. So they stole a bike and a gun, and he assassinated him. Resistance workers were being captured, and they were being turned by the Germans because they were being interrogated, tortured, and also their relatives were being threatened with deportation, if not death. So they too were giving out snippets of information. Sometimes only a small piece of information was enough to condemn people. The Allies, early 43, were not fussed about resistance. By late 43, suddenly thought the resistance was really important. Rather than dropping huge numbers of bombs on France, we could use the resistance to take out certain points. And that's more effective, more efficient, and there's less chance of French deaths. Most of the 100 to 200 political prisoners, so it was critical that resistance was very strong in the northern part of France, and particularly important in the Amiens area. Most of the political prisoners in the prison were going to be shot or deported, but we have to remember a lot of minor criminals were probably just going to be released or given minor sentences. So there's clearly a tragedy in this. However, it sent a message that the Allies would help the French resistance. They would come to help them. They wouldn't just leave their people to die in prison at the hands of the Germans. We should not forget the personal element to this. Basil Embry escaped and evaded the Germans through the help of people who were effectively part of the French resistance. And clearly, as we saw earlier, he was involved in 3 raids that had a resistance element to it. The raid on the chateau, it was because of a soldier, an SAS trooper, who was part of Operation Bullbasket, who was clubbed to death by the Germans when he was caught, and 7 resistance people were killed on the spot. And Tonkin, who was in charge of Bullbasket, radioed London and called in the attack on the chateau. So that attack had a resistance side to it. Philippe Lévy-Lavelle was in the resistance. His daughter was in the resistance. He knew key resistance figures in the UK and France. Percy Pickard had ran a taxi service for the SOE and resistance. He knew resistance people, including he'd met people involved who were calling in this raid. Finally, huge sacrifices were made by the French during the Second World War. We shouldn't forget it. In the 1970s, someone, I think a British author, calculated that every member of aircrew who was spirited out of France back to UK, 3 French people died because of it. So the figures are dreadful. And of course we have to remember that acts by resistance could result in tragic consequences, with the Germans killing multiples of people in retaliation for the killing of one or few of their own people. So, in a nutshell, it was a raid carried out by very brave people in an attempt to rescue very brave people. But sadly, a lot of people, about 100 people died. That's it, thank you.